grew up in a very small town in the middle of nowhere in Texas, and got into music actually just looking for a social life, so to speak, which obviously didn't really pan out. But I had some relatives that had played clarinet, so I picked it up, wound up enjoying it, started taking private lessons, got pretty good, realized that at least, this could be a good scholarship ticket to get into college somewhere. And it was. So I wound up going to Oberlin, and I pursued a double degree in English literature and clarinet performance. At the time, thinking that I was going to continue on in music and go to grad school and play in an orchestra. About my junior year, I'd say, though, I realized that wasn't necessarily the right fit. Just orchestral politics and sort of the repetition, the lack of creativity, and it wasn't really for me. I knew, if you don't get along with the conductor that you're working with, you're sort of stuck wherever you wind up. And that's not a comment on any of the conductors that I had, who were great to work with. Actually, it was sort of starting to talk to industry professionals who were frustrated and a little bit bitter about their lives at this point. I wanted to make sure that didn't happen with my career. So I figured I could always play chamber music on the side and switch to writing, which I'd also loved since high school, and realized that writing about music was sort of a very natural way to pursue a career. And so after Oberlin, I went and got a master's degree in journalism at Syracuse University, the Newhouse School. Came out and worked for the Fort Worth Symphony for a year as their press manager, so writing press releases, working on the program book, some marketing copy. So I worked there during the strike they had in 2016, actually. So that was sort of a trial by fire way to learn the backgrounds of orchestral management and sort of PR ideas about strikes. And then, so I got there 2 weeks before the strike started, and then the strike lasted about 3 months. And then the rest of the year, they were performing concerts, and I was there for their summer season, Concerts in the Garden, which is actually quite a lot of fun. It's a huge outdoor show, or a series of huge outdoor shows for about 2 months of the summer. So yeah, got to see both sides of the operation. A year after that, I wound up in Pittsburgh. I got tapped to come and be the music critic for the Post-Gazette here in Pittsburgh. There's an organization called the Rubin Institute that, as far as I know, I believe was originally founded at Oberlin. And every other year, they'll get together a bunch of the best critics in the country and do a workshop with some young writers to sort of try and keep classical music criticism alive. Because, everybody knows arts coverage is continuing to be slashed and all that. So this is a stopgap. I never actually went to the Institute, which is now in San Francisco instead of Oberlin, because the dean of Oberlin is now the president of San Francisco, and it sort of followed him. But the way it works now is they still run that workshop, but this Rubin Institute also funds journalism or classical music critics at a few different papers around the country. So there's me, there's a girl in Boston, somebody in Seattle, Houston, San Francisco, Cleveland. They're actually working with newspapers and smaller online publications to provide some funding to keep classical music reviews sort of in the public sphere. So I'm receiving a grant from the Rubin Foundation, which includes Getty Foundation money and San Francisco Conservatory funding, and that's sort of keeping my job alive. It's a contract that's renewed annually. So right now I'm contracted through August of this year. There's every potential to renew, but you never know for sure until you get there. So they've been very generous so far, and there's no reason to think that it's not going to continue, but they've got their own organization and their own grants to pursue to make sure this continues happening. I haven't yet, but through the journalism masters and just, being a little bit tenacious, which you kind of have to be to survive in a career like this, of course, I've reached out to some of the different critics around the country. So just to have conversations or to ask for advice, in the beginning of the year. So Alex Ross, Emma Jett, Tim Page, some of the names that are associated. Coincidentally, I've just sort of reached out anyway to get in touch. Yeah. That's funny. That's sort of changing now because of the digital versus print. Last year, when I had to get them into the print paper within a certain amount of time, it was sort of report what happened, what they played, and whether they did it well, and try to convey through the language that I use sort of the spirit of the event and sort of, the quality of the event. So primarily, I'd say they were for people who had been there, just to start a conversation about what they heard, maybe using slightly more musical language than the average person might, so sort of leading a conversation. And then also for the people who weren't there who might have been interested, whether, if there were subscribers that couldn't go or somebody around the country who wanted to read about the soloist, then it's supposed to provide a picture of, a snapshot of how the evening went in that case. On my goal. I have no problem with the idea of a review encouraging people to go to a concert. I think that'd be great. I'd love if Heinz Hall were filled every time, but no, I don't work for the symphony. I work for the paper. My job is to report on what happened for anybody who's interested. Yeah, I'm usually whether it's positive or negative, whether somebody agrees or not. I mean, I'm always happy. I've gotten a few phone calls here and there, or it's usually emails, or sometimes just comments on the article on the digital version. But yeah, I love it when somebody has a passionate response either to the music or to something I've said about the music. And again, agree or disagree is fine. Part of the point is to foster a conversation, and if that happens, that means people are invested and interested enough to start thinking about it. And while it's not really my goal to fill seats directly, I mean, by keeping the language about music going and trying to show some passion and interest in this art form, I mean, I'd be happy if a byproduct of that was that people were interested enough to pick up a ticket and to go hear it, obviously. So but it's sort of two different things. I think certainly none of the papers go out of their way to ignore. Most of them just aren't aware. And whether that's on them or on the symphony is sort of a subjective debate. I mean, obviously I do what I can with the reviews and whatnot. And certainly I feature the symphony pretty regularly in the sort of bigger idea pieces that I try to write. Pittsburgh comes up often. And whenever I speak with leaders at the symphony or of the board there, or people sort of behind the scenes, or even musicians, everybody's primary goal, or what they say needs to happen, is we need to remind the public, both at home and at large, that Pittsburgh is one of the great orchestras of the country, and really the world in a lot of ways. Everybody's always shocked at how few people realize that. So it's a real problem. That's sort of one of the goals of the new board chair that I talked to a few months ago, is trying to get the symphony into the conversation about how Pittsburgh is this up and coming, sort of thriving, fantastic city. I mean, economic indications here are very good, and for the most part, people don't talk about the orchestra, and that's too bad. It would be great if the media could do more to help. It would be great if the symphony could figure out how to talk about it more publicly, a little bit more often. Now, Alex Ross is at the top of my list. Both his current coverage, his books, and his previous work. I mean, that guy can write, and his knowledge of music is unparalleled. I mean, his books, which are not exactly scholarly works, I mean, they are, but they're meant to be more approachable than that, are used in some of the best conservatories in the world as textbooks at this point. Like, he's an amazing writer, and just a really nice guy. And also, so Tim Page, I've actually studied with at one point. So he's sort of he's teaching at USC now in California, but he was, of course, a critic at the Washington Post for forever, I think, and also worked at the Times for a while. He's also just an amazing writer and a really good guy. I keep following Emma Jett, of course, down in DC, and then Mark Swed over in LA is also sort of, he's got an amazing knowledge of the new music scene, and sort of has networked enough with composers of the modern day that he's yeah, those are sort of my top four, I'd say, at the moment. I mean, newspapers are struggling everywhere for myriad reasons. I mean, the business model is changing because we're going more digital. People are trying to figure out how to make money off of subscriptions as opposed to advertisements. You don't make as much money in advertisements from the web as you do in print. But as print is shrinking, and especially with the tariffs on print newspaper at the moment, it's everything is sort of shifting in a digital direction. So with that said, what that means is, especially in this information age, editors and the sort of higher ups at the paper are keeping an eye on how many people are reading what article, because we can track that now. And that's part of why arts coverage is struggling so much. Is, of course, it's very niche. I mean, whether it's visual art, opera, the symphony, dance, theater, anything. Reviews tend to score the lowest in terms of hits or clicks or whatever you want to call them of really any article. And fewer hits and clicks means less interest. Theoretically, it means less subscriptions, less advertising dollars. So that's one of the reasons it's often the first thing to go at a paper. And that's why arts coverage across the country is going away. Dallas Morning News just slashed their A&E budget, as I understand it, just a couple of weeks ago, actually. The Critic in Baltimore, Tim Smith, just retired a few weeks ago, or took a buyout. I think he retired. Anyway, so what that means is we are struggling, we, as in arts critics in general, are struggling to write in a way that is interesting enough online to get the average person to read, or figure out the channels by which to push out our product such that the people that are already interested will be able to find it more easily than, 6 jumps through hoops on a website. So it's a matter of shifting the language we use to talk about things in terms of the reviews, and obviously social media plays a huge component. It's about trying to plug into the community that's already there. I'd say that changes more with feature coverage and sort of news coverage about organizations than reviews in some ways. Even though I'm the classical music critic, well, really I'm the classical music reporter and critic. So I cover the business side of the organizations as well. So the symphony, the opera, the chamber music groups, pretty much most of the classical music organizations in the city. So my job is to both review them fairly regularly and keep an eye on the quality and keep the conversation about them going, but also to keep track of the finances and the issues at play in the art form. So I've been here about 1.5 years now. The longer I'm here, the more I'm realizing sort of if I can relate music to a larger topic that interests people. First of all, it's more interesting to write in a lot of ways. It has more broad application and broad appeal, but also it tends to gather a larger readership than it otherwise would have. So talking about things like music and retirement, music and neuroscience, music and mental health, things of that nature. It's bringing a music background to general topics like that. I'm finding a readership that is very much interested in sort of learning about these things from this particular background. It happens pretty often here, which is good news. I'd say at least once every month or two, I'll hear something and go, that was really amazing. Wow, I really love my job. I'm so glad I get to hear this and sort of engage with it on this level and think about it. Most recently, well, maybe not most recently, I'm trying to pick one. That's actually kind of tricky. There was the Pittsburgh Symphony premiered a new piece by Mason Bates this season, back in late September, I think it was. And there have been very good performances since then, don't get me wrong, but that one blew my socks off. I mean, first of all, it was a new piece, which is always great. I love Mason Bates' work, and just the quality of artistry for that performance was, and especially that piece, was just off the charts. I mean, yes, absolutely. They are consistently really, really good, but every now and then there's something special about a concert. And you're asking whether that's a challenge or not. Not really. I mean, because the reviews that I'm writing aren't really a report card, so it's not, here's what they did well, here's what went badly, even though that's certainly an element of the review. It's more, again, trying to capture the feeling of the evening and sort of the broad strokes of what happened and how it felt. So, if performances that are really good, and if they're consistently really good, then the reviews are going to remain pretty upbeat and positive. And even if a few things went wrong, you don't necessarily have to mention everything. It's more about the sense of the evening. But sure, every now and then when something really special happens, then I get to sort of pull out the stops, get a little bit more flowery perhaps, which I've gotten emails about here and there, and just sort of explain to people why this was such an amazing evening, at least in my opinion. Yes, I don't think I've ever heard this orchestra give a bad concert. I have heard this orchestra give a mediocre concert or two. Yeah, and it's again, sure, without naming names, but it usually involves a guest conductor. Manfred Honig, the music director here, tends to be solid. Pittsburgh Symphony goes on tour in Europe. They sell out halls like that. We have a better reputation in Europe than here sometimes, which is not great. Of course, there's a tour, the halls are smaller, there are a host of other factors that make that less significant than it sounds. But still, it's well known in Europe as one of the great orchestras. So touring in general, it does change the perception of the orchestra abroad and at home, as long as people realize that the orchestra is on tour. Most people in Pittsburgh wouldn't have noticed when the orchestra was gone for 3 weeks, And again, whether that's sort of a press issue or a public relations issue, depends on who you talk to. Probably both. But we could talk about Baltimore if you'd like, which just got back from an amazing European tour and is now sort of facing a potential lockout in the next week or two, which is not great. So you, um, budgetarily, because the money is so completely separate from everything else they do, it tends not to have too much of an effect on the city. It's really a prestige thing, which is important and valuable, but it's sort of soft metrics valuable. It doesn't translate directly into dollars for the city or tourism or anything. It's just a point of pride to hang a hat on later, which is important, but sometimes it's hard to convince people that, especially people who are more interested in the bottom dollar than anything else. That's possible. I mean, I would say the pop culture angle is especially important, yes, but it's also that he was American. I mean, he's one of like really truly well-known greats of American composers from the 20th century. I mean, which is now, but Bernstein has a good fortune of being dead, so his music is taken more seriously. Right? I actually like not all, but a good chunk of Bernstein's music. I'm partial to the Jeremiah Symphony. I'm okay with the Mass. Actually, I go back and forth depending on the day. I thank God, I actually like the Candide Overture. So it has, and On the Town, good God. But, Bach-Track, that I think it's a UK-based publication. So I'm sure you saw their metrics about Bernstein being one of the most performed composers this year, right up there with Beethoven and Mozart. Yeah, it's the centennial effect, which happens with any composer. But I think we're seeing it much more than normal with Bernstein, simply because he's American, because of his sort of pop legend status. Part of the Bernstein angle and issue, I mean, sure, it's a centennial, but every orchestra's marketing department ever looks for anything they can to make a concert seem special, which is difficult to do because much as I love classical music and going to concerts, most concerts don't obviously differentiate themselves. I mean, you're probably going to hear an overture, a concerto, and a symphony. And again, I'm passionate about this. I love going. Every performance is unique, and oftentimes they're amazing. So I don't mind, but I understand the difficulty from a marketing perspective, and that you need to, you got to sell it somehow, whether that's a pop reference or a historical reference in the case of Bernstein, or more often it's the soloist, or in every program and in a fair amount of the marketing collateral and in the season announcement for this year in Pittsburgh, the orchestra is playing a lot of pieces that they have never played before. And they're using this as a peg to go, come here to these concerts, it'll be music that you haven't heard, which probably, well, may not be true. We just haven't heard this orchestra do that. All that to say, marketing a symphony is hard. I'm not too worried, actually. I think, at least in the major cities in America and the country, I think the orchestras are doing fine. They're doing pretty well. There's enough funding for them to remain creative, to diversify their streams of programming between, the standard symphonies for the old guard, different kinds of music in different venues to try to attract a newer audience. And I don't think they necessarily have to mingle for those sorts of tracks to be successful. I think it's fine for the symphonies to diversify and bring in different audiences at different times. I don't think the ultimate goal necessarily needs to be bringing everybody in to hear Beethoven 9 once a year. So I think the orchestras with the resources and the money to be able to do that are going to be just fine. So, the big orchestras around the country are doing all right. It's the mid-sized and smaller orchestras that are certainly in trouble. I mean, we're seeing that in Pittsburgh in the past couple of years. We're seeing that in Baltimore right now. San Antonio last year, the Lyric Opera Orchestra in Chicago. All of these orchestras have had trouble negotiating contracts, have been close or have gone on strike. Fort Worth Symphony, the Philadelphia Orchestra, Detroit, Atlanta, Minnesota, all of these are sort of strike orchestras over the last 5 to 10 years or so. And that's because they're in smaller markets. There isn't as much corporate and individual giving in these cities. So it's more tied to the economic fortunes of the city in a lot of ways than anything else. It depends on sort of corporate giving and individual giving. But of course, it's also tied to whether music can be made relevant, which is a buzzword that everybody is learning to hate in the music industry because it's been around too long and it's getting used too often. But there's a reason for that. It's how do we make classical music appeal to a broader audience, and how do we make it important enough that people think and see it as something to give money to. And I think there's some success there as well with tying music to more humanitarian aims, like food drives, raising money for refugees, partnering with international organizations or different civic organizations. And that's where some of the smaller orchestras are selling out concerts. Yeah, I've heard about concerts in California where a symphony partnered with I think it was a Vietnamese embassy and sort of sold out of concerts to people affiliated with that organization. And they've been doing that a couple of different times, or inviting people to come do a concert for free if they donated some food, and those tend to sell out as well at various places. So all of this to say, I think orchestras in classical music are going to be fine. I do think we're seeing a restructuring. I think it's going to affect the top the least. I think a lot of the smaller orchestras are in serious trouble. They're going to move towards part-time. The people that play in them and work for them are going to have to do these collage careers that are becoming more common in really any profession. I mean, you want to talk about the shrinking middle class, we can do that as well. I think the mid-sized orchestras are probably going to see the most shift, as they're going to figure out whether their city and the citizens of the city want to support a major full-time symphony orchestra, or whether they don't. And that's sort of up to the orchestra to be able to convince them that they need to. Some are succeeding, some aren't. It kind of depends on who's running the ship in those cases. So the level of kids coming out of school now is just phenomenal, and it's going up. And part of what is making it so hard to get jobs, but it's also, I mean, kids can play right now. Unfortunately, at the moment, we're seeing a little bit of a push for new music, which is good. I think orchestras are starting to try a little bit harder to keep it alive, to partner with either different kinds of musical creators or certainly support composers a little bit more than they have been in the past, which is also a good sign. So sure, Pittsburgh is right in the middle of whether, is it going to be one of the great orchestras or is it going to slide down? So after the strike, the musicians and management have signed a 5-year agreement. We're in year 3, so we've got about 2 years until we really find out. I mean, I can tell you everybody who's aware of this at least is holding their breath. Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Minnesota, really Dallas, Houston, these sort of I'd say lower, they're at the lower end of the highest tier of orchestras in the country. In terms of budget size, I mean, orchestras, of course, are divided, in terms of how much revenue they generate, what the operating budget is. And really the question is going to be, can they sustain the salaries of the musicians at the current levels and give them the raises that they're looking for? And if they can't, is this going to diminish the artistic quality? Probably. And that's probably what's going to happen in some of these cities. So it's not a rosy picture, but so far they're sort of limping along and doing okay. So we'll see what happens in the future. And I mean, the soloist fees are astronomical, and part of that's tied to the marketing idea of, you need these names to sell classical music, which, you might see a bump, but given that ticket sales aren't covering much of any, it's certainly less than 50%, in most cases under about 36% of an orchestra's budget anyway. I'm not sure the fees that the people at the top of the food chain artistically are seeing are, whether they're justified or not might be a different conversation, but I'm not sure they're sustainable. But institutionally, I mean, around the country, music directors, they make good money. Well, and depending on the city. So the Pittsburgh Symphony actually, I mean, we're not directly paying for them, of course, at all. And we're like, governmental funding only accounts for a fairly small percentage of the budget. But I mean, we pay a little. But beyond that, it's does a music director, is the job different enough from the sort of average musician that it, 10 to 12 to 13 times the actual salary? Well, right. Apparently the market says so right now, so I'm sure there is something to that. Like I said, planning to look into it and write on it sometime this spring, probably. But